Why do you see so many campaigns and brands out in the world that look so much the same? That is not a reflection of the execution of those campaigns. Like, they were shot beautifully. I'm sure they actually nailed their brief and they did a great job. But upstream, I don't think the brands are differentiating enough because of a marketing mentality that is on playbooks and sort of data-driven, backwards-looking processes that have more certainty to them versus more of a creative input that seeks more originality and differentiation.
Welcome to the Backcountry Marketing Podcast. Today, I'm sitting down with Matt Trappe. He is the photographer, director, and creator. He's a brand marketer in the running world. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Cole, for having me. I have looked up to your podcast for a long time listener, first time caller, and I'm really excited to be here. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thanks for the kind words. I've said it so many times, but this show wouldn't be anything without the folks who actually sit down and have these conversations. So right back at you. Matt, one of the things I appreciate about you is I feel like you have a ton of varied perspective on our industry. You've worked at the brand level, you've worked in the production world, the creative world, and I've also seen you engaging a lot with actually former guests on this show, Matt Powell and other folks who come at the industry from a more economics perspective.
Yeah.
And what I love about the things that you talk about and the things that you post about in your work is like you're kind of blending all three of these worlds together. And when I think about trying to do that, I get quickly overwhelmed and frustrated, which is why one of the reasons why I'm excited to chat with you is because you're trying to bring all these things together with your unique perspective that you have. Why is that something that, like, why do you spend the effort trying to wrestle through that?
Well, I'm not, I don't know, I'm not doing it so deliberately as much as just following what I'm interested in, where my interests, where my background lie. It's kind of all coming together now because I really learned this industry really well. I learned the running industry really well from shooting with athletes, shooting at, about all the races, all the events. I've shot all sorts of different product launches, from the footwear to apparel and you name it. I've worked with so many different brands and I've really felt like I've gotten to know the culture, the sport, the people and the players really, really well. And also just this the storytelling approach that I like to have and that I see from others. I've become, I think, a good storyteller through all that experience. So all these things kind of came together from, within my background. And I think I just have I don't know if it's unique. I just have my own perspective on what I see happening in the running industry and in the outdoor world, and to some degree. And I'm just trying to articulate, what I see from my position to try to make us all better.
Yeah. If you had to sum your entire perspective up into one word, what word would you choose?
Oh man. The one word stuff is because the simplicity is more difficult than complexity, right? And so like one word is so difficult. I don't, maybe it's two words, but something along the lines of being dual brained. I think I can see things from a creative standpoint, but also like from a really practical sort of business and numbers standpoint. So maybe that's a hyphened word. One word.
I'll accept it. That works.
Okay.
Yeah. So before we dive in, before we continue to dive in, rather, I guess I want to put kind of a disclaimer out there. I think in this episode, we might be a little critical of the industry. And I guess that isn't necessarily a reflection on any individual people or persons who are working in the industry. I think you and I approach this from the perspective that, we want things to be better for whatever that means, whatever better means. And so I guess one of my questions is like, what role do people who, and I know you have a bigger background than just production and just creative, but what role do creatives and people in production have when it comes to talking about these decisions that are often made upstream, well beyond folks out in the field executing with the camera? And I guess to add to that, I think we're going to get critical. And Matt, I know you also have some solutions that we're probably going to bring up at the end of this episode. So folks feel like we're being harsh, like we're not just trying to poke holes. We do want to bring some some ideas and solutions to the table also.
I don't. I guess I don't think of it as like being critical. I think I see things changing so fast,
Mm.
and they're not being like ways that worked before don't necessarily work now. And so we're all just learning and evolving at such a breakneck speed that I guess I don't view having, different opinions or different ideas or any feedback on things as being critical in a negative way. It's more just like contributing to this like zeitgeist of learning and evolving, and all of us figuring out like what is happening and how do we adapt to that moving forward. That's sort of, I guess, my perspective on like, the idea of being overly critical. But I see, I guess like back to your question about how we can be better. And I think in traditional production, like you've always in the past been handed a brief, right? And it's like, here's what we're making. Like, can you execute on this? And the deeper I got into that, and after doing that a lot, I started to have a lot more ideas on like why we were doing this in the first place. Like, what was the concept? What's the messaging? What's the strategy of the purpose of creating this thing in the first place? And that was, often getting lost. And I had coming, from the business background, just like a lot more questions, and I wanted a lot more visibility into like what's the strategy here. And a lot of times you don't always get that right on a production. You don't always get the bigger picture. You're not always informed or brought into that right early in the process. I'm sure you can probably relate to that, Cole. So I started just asking more questions and trying to move into that conversation because I felt I had a lot to add, especially within running. Like I knew this industry, I knew the culture, I knew the people really, really well, and I wanted to provide some feedback to that. That wasn't always met. I mean, and not with everybody, but in some situations that like wasn't always met positively. I mean, I had one brand that wanted to shoot a product campaign, and they had some product they wanted to integrate for trail running that was, a waist pack, like your very like basic like fanny pack, that we might call it here in the States. And I gave them feedback on that. I was like, look, nobody's gonna run with that. Like that's gonna bounce around. Like that's not gonna. It's not a good look for the brand if you want to come across like you really know the sport really well in this ad. And I mean, they didn't like that. They didn't want that feedback. This was several years ago now, but they told me that they thought I was working on other campaigns for other running brands at the same time. And it's like, well, okay, well, I sign NDAs. I can't tell you that, but like, of course I work on campaigns for other running. Like, this is why you're hiring me. Right. And so we ended our relationship. That shoot never happened. And, I chalk it up to some of that feedback being unwelcomed, that I provided. But I think there is more of a role that creatives can play upstream in some of these processes. And I'd like to see that start to happen more. And I guess, like without going into like just about everything I had to say, like, I'll turn it back to you there, Cole, but I think that's kind of like the part of the like larger point that I'm trying to make.
So in that example, you're critiquing the product that they're asking you to shoot. I mean, that's like a decision that was made 2 years ago.
Yeah, right.
And now they're
Right.
receiving criticism from the field that, oh, maybe
Right.
this isn't actually a good fit. Like that's pretty brutal feedback to hear, I think, from the
I'm
brand's
sure.
perspective.
I'm sure, but I think you need to really know the culture, really know your audience like pretty early in the process. And you had the recent pod episode that you did with Chris Burkhardt, like really spoke to me because he made the point that nobody wants to be hired for just being able to operate a camera, right? Like we all want to believe we have more, and so I really subscribed to that, and I spoke up, and that it wasn't super discouraging for me. It just was like, okay, there's really a need for more of a voice upstream in the process, and I want to try to have that more. And so I'm doing that with the newsletter, doing that with some consulting. I'm doing that by starting my own brand and trying to, sort of put my money where my mouth is. But I think that creatives can have more of an impact upstream than we're often allowed to have. And I think some brands that do that start to see more success.
Well, yeah, what are some of those impacts that you'd like to try and influence, or what have you influenced?
The I've worked with more startups, I think, than big brands to where they're and it speaks to a lot of the success small brands are having really in general, right? The small brands, especially in running right now, like are really booming. Brands like Satisfy, brands like Bandit, that really have a a distinct identity that they're able to speak to, and that maybe is a bit easier for them to do as smaller brands that aren't owned by that publicly traded or multinational corporations. But those are the examples that I look at that are really having a bigger impact within the public, because they know an audience and they know their customer, so to speak. I don't always like that word as much, but they know their audience, a lot better, and they're just more entrenched like in the culture of a sport.
Hmm. Do you feel like that's not the case with larger brands, or does that tend not to be the case?
I think it's more difficult. I think they become a bit more disconnected the larger that you get. I think you have more chefs in the kitchen making decisions. I think the decisions start to become more removed from the ground level employees that are really, out in the world. As there become, more layers of management, and the C-suite people aren't necessarily showing up, and running like at the races and things like that. And so I think it becomes a lot more difficult, and that's probably, one of the reasons that you see this happen, or the disconnect more often in those larger corporations. I mean, there's one, I'll give you another example too. Like there was a brand campaign that I shot for a brand a couple years ago that was about, the theme was rule breakers, and it's an authenticity story, I suppose, because this was a large multinational corporation. There was no rule breaking, like culturally, like going on, like everything was very process oriented, and it just was not. I think it was meant to speak to the customer, but it was just not at all authentic to the brand and what they were doing, and that disconnect was really huge. And so it's hard being asked to shoot campaigns and just upfront that this idea isn't gonna work. Like this isn't connected to your brand. There's no like cohesion here in this larger brand story, right, that we're telling. And that was a really strong example for me where I felt like more of a storyteller or a creative mindset would have helped to just because you want to be able to share your work, right? And you're shooting something like that and you're asked to execute it, and you know this isn't going to work. And no matter how well you execute that, I mean, you could shoot that campaign beautifully. It could be perfect, but this isn't going to hit because it just doesn't align with the brand, the message, the product. Like the whole story doesn't fit that message. And I think that was an example too of the need that I saw just to try to speak to this this disconnect that was upstream from any production, like you and I were doing.
Yeah, so I guess my first experience with what you're describing was a couple years ago. I was talking with a potential client, and they were talking about, they wanted to go out and shoot these ambassador like short stories.
Yeah.
Like little profiles on their ambassadors. I was like, okay,
Yeah.
that sounds rad. And then as we started talking and we started getting into more of the weeds and talking about why are we making this, like, what are we trying to communicate? Like, what are the stories? How does it ladder up to your brand? Like, how are you going to deploy these?
Right.
There weren't a lot of answers to those questions. And so I told them, I was like, okay, like we could go out and shoot this, but if there isn't a good strategy or there isn't cohesion, I wonder how effective it's going to be. And the proposal that I ended up putting forward was, I gave like 3 options. Option 1 was, or option 3 was, okay, we're just going to go out and do production. Option 2 was we're going to come in and do production, but we're also going to help with like content strategy and making this feel more cohesive. Option 3 was we're going to do those 2 things and we're going to help solidify some of these brand questions that haven't yet been answered. And so we were going to pull in strategists and we were going to pull in, brand experts amongst our production team.
Yeah.
And the feedback I was getting the whole time was like, yeah, like we need clarity. Like we need help figuring out how to move forwards. And then
Yeah.
when it came time to making a decision, they were like, we really just need someone who's going to go out and shoot these things. And I was like, interesting. So all the feedback I was hearing was like, we need help finding clarity and our direction. But then at the end of the day, and maybe it was for a number of other reasons,
Hmm.
but ultimately they were like, we just need someone to go and shoot. And at that point, I was like, huh, what do people? What's the perception of people in production? Is it we're really
Right.
just hired guns and we're
Yeah.
just doing everyone's bidding, or is there a role and a place for us upstream to influence some of these things? And that's led me on like a multi, year
Yes.
or two journey to like try and answer that question.
I think maybe what you were running into that I see often is there's just a time crunch too.
Sure.
And if you start talking about it too much, it's like, okay, well, we have this deadline we have to hit because there's this, quarterly goal and we have this plan and we have to stay on track. And so it's like, just go do it because now I have to get on to the next thing, right? And people internally are very busy and they have a lot of things on their plate. And I have a lot of empathy for that because I've been in that situation like in the corporate world before, and that's really difficult. So I think that's not to like fault people too much, but I think that's some of what the like brands are up against right internally is trying to manage all the things going on and the timelines that they have. But you're totally right in that I don't and these are the questions I'm kind of asking out loud and just like maybe just proposing to the audience like what is the what is the path for creatives within the corporate world? Like if you are in production, you are a creative person and you want to really contribute to a brand upstream in this way. Is it an agency model? Do brands bring people in-house and incorporate this? Do they encourage this sort of like creative thinking, creative strategy thought? What is the career path for someone looking to do that? And I think that's something would have a lot of valuable effect on the industry and like a good question we should be asking.
I think those are great questions. Do you have any answers to those?
I think so. I have a distinction that makes a lot of sense to me. I want to see what you think about it, maybe what the audience thinks about it. A distinction between a marketer and a creative, and the way that I think traditionally maybe they're thought of sort of as one and the same. I would define a marketer as someone that prefers a playbook, maybe process and some certainty to that. But then I would look at a creative as someone completely on the other end of that spectrum, someone who is terrified of a playbook in that they may be perceived as just copying this thing. No creative wants to be seen as just copying something. They really seek originality. And that really separates the term marketing and creative on like, opposite ends of a spectrum there. And so I'd like just encourage more of that creative thinking in business and in marketing.
Okay, let's dive into that. I'm curious
Mm-hmm.
to examine that. So I guess my first question would be, why is it important to distinguish between marketing and creative? I guess what does that first do for us if we determine these are two different things?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it starts to answer the question that we're asking, right? Like, why do you see so many campaigns and brands out in the world that look so much the same? Why do so many? And there was one that came out in the running world not long ago. That was for like a Max Cushion shoe for two different brands. And they, unfortunately for both of them, launched on the same day. And the campaigns that came out they were absolutely identical, like shot in an urban setting, like showing this shoe squish. Even like the graphics were super similar. And these are two like totally different running brands. And, I posted about that, commenting about the sea of sameness. And I think that happens. And that another point I want to make on that is like, that is not a reflection of the execution of those campaigns. Like they were shot beautifully. I'm sure they actually nailed their brief and they did a great job. But upstream, I don't think the brands are differentiating enough because of a marketing mentality that is on playbooks and sort of data-driven, backwards-looking processes that have more certainty to them versus more of a creative input that seeks more originality and differentiation.
Interesting. So, okay, so in your idea of creative versus marketing, so marketing
Mhm.
is a little more rule bound, a little more process focused, and creative is what, like the Wild West, or how would you define creative?
Well, so it's rooted in really knowing your audience. It's rooted in really knowing your sport, the culture that you're speaking to, right? And then you're creative within those bounds. Um, but you're creating something new. I mean, that's where like the term creative comes from is that originality. There's going back to the small brands that we see in running. One of the brands that's really eating up a lot of the oxygen in the room is a smaller brand that's growing rapidly called Satisfy Running, and this is an example of this originality. Satisfy is from Paris. They speak to a Southwest U.S. Sort of vibe and mindset, which is right so disconnected from Paris. They came out with performance running products on the absolute premium end of like the pricing spectrum. I mean, a $200 T-shirt, and they've been met with wild success and just saw a huge infusion of capital and investment in the brand at the running event trade show in November. The oxygen they were eating up in the room, the chat on the floor was all about satisfy this small brand more than the massive running brands we all know.
Mm.
And if you had looked at data, if you had looked at playbooks, no one was asking for a brand like that. No one was asking for products at that price. No one expected a Parisian brand to have a Southwest U.S. aesthetic, and it's working because it was original and it was its own thing. And so that kind of speaks, I guess, to my point about like marketers really being data driven and sort of looking for things that already exist and replicating those versus a creative being original and coming up with something new, despite like of course there's a bit more inherent risk with that.
Hmm.
But in that case, like that was really, really effective.
Yeah, so what about Satisfy, like, makes them work? Is it their deep understanding of their audience, or, like, what are the ingredients you think that are
So
working?
I mean, so this is talked about a lot and speculated a lot within the running industry. I think from a branding standpoint, they have a very distinct and clear identity and message, and they know the people that they're speaking to, and it is not everyone, and they're completely okay with that. I think there is an authenticity in that the founder, this is all his actual interests. I mean, so they're launching a running shoe right now that is fashioned in many ways after a radio control car, like an RC car.
Well,
The tread on the bottom of the shoe is actual. It mimics a tire on an RC car and the grip that might have, and it looks very much like that. It doesn't look like a car tire. It has like the larger nubbies on the bottom, and so there even the box looks and the decals like sort of that come with the shoe. Like this is launching in next month in March, and all of this mimics an RC car. No one asked for a running shoe to parallel an RC car. But there's a lot of authenticity in that these are their general interests. And so they just dive really, really deep into these stories and then communicate them really, really well. And that draws people in.
so you've mentioned twice now that no one was asking for this brand to
Right.
pop up. But it also sounds like it's hard to put your finger on what exactly makes it unique. Does it speak to you in a particular way? Like, are you the audience? Are you not the audience?
No,
Like
I'm
you
not the audience.
yourself?
I don't own anything Satisfy. I'm not the audience, but I very much respect what they're doing and how they're being so distinctly and unapologetically themselves, and it's working. It sort of flips the model on its head. Like traditionally in marketing, you go out and you find consumer insights and then you bring those internally and you figure out how to translate those into your brand and your product. And this is kind of the opposite. I mean, they just said this is what we are, this is what we believe in, and they started from a place of authenticity to themselves, to the company, to the people that worked there, and then put that out into the world, versus maybe finding insights and customers or an audience externally that might not fit your brand internally and having to try to match those up. that can start to show through, like I mentioned before, in some brand campaigns that just don't quite hit. So I think that, I mean, it's such a buzzword, authenticity, but that's really what it is for me. Like, they live this life that is the brand. And I think that shows and speaks to a lot of their success.
How does that impact their creative? Does it feel very them?
Yeah, I think it makes it easy. I think they just say, this is cool. We think this is cool. This is the lifestyle that we live. And they just storytell through that lens, which is so real that they don't have to try, if that makes sense.
Well, if you work backwards from a brief, which is what usually we're given, you have a brief, then maybe there's a content strategy, and then there's a marketing plan, and then above that there's a brand, and then there's something up at that level that is differentiating the brand from all the other brands out there, like theoretically. But if that differentiation component isn't strong, then that trickles all the way down to the briefs and ultimately the creative that gets produced.
Correct.
Do you feel like that is one of the common stumbling blocks that many brands have?
I think that absolutely speaks to it. I think it's either a lot of the same, or it's just not clear from, way up high in organizations. And so that ends up just becoming bland by the time that trickles down and ends up getting slid over to us in a brief. And I think the reason that I'm leaning on creatives and incorporating them more or earlier in this process is, and this too, like, as a storyteller, your skill is being able to wade through all of the side stories, being able to wade through all of the mess and see the thread of his storyline, and communicate that in a really engaging way, which is really marketing, and which is really what all of this is about, isn't it? It's about communicating this identity and this story of a brand that people will identify with and will resonate with them, and not just selling a puffy jacket or a product, and some are marginally better than others, et cetera, but there's this whole emotional component of really connecting with people, and so that when they put on that jacket or those shoes, they feel like they're part of this thing, and this brand speaks to me, and that has its own separate set of value than the actual product features or what have you. And I think that's kind of what all this is getting at, is providing more value from that side for brands versus just these product features and benefits.
Nicholas Bornling, who's on the show, gosh, maybe
he's great.
Yeah, he said this thing that stuck out to me. He was like, great marketing is great storytelling.
Yes.
Like, full stop.
Yes.
And I was like, oh my gosh, like, yes, like, he's so right. But because a good story knows its audience, it knows what it's trying to communicate.
Right.
It knows ideally like what makes this story unique, and you could use those same principles at the 30,000 foot level, way upstream, when making those big brand choices.
Yes, and he is I have to go back and look at that episode. He is fantastic, because if you look at in running, anyone in trail running especially knows the Salomon TV episodes that Salomon made, Trail Running TV, before it merged with the skiing. The trail running TV in the 2015-16 era was so great and was so deep and really resonated with the lifestyle and the culture in trail running. It really raised the tide of the sport and brought people into the sport without being overtly like Salomon, here's our product. But there's still stories that resonate with people to this day about the lifestyle of trail running. And that started with Nicholas Bornling and Salomon, and he actually brought it from skiing, I think, over to trail running. But was told like beautifully by Dean Leslie, the African Attachment, down in South Africa. I think Dean's outfit now is called Wandering Fever. But they then did a beautiful job of executing on what was an excellent upstream idea, right? To really attach the brand to the lifestyle of trail running and speak to that. So he absolutely gets it and was a fantastic guest. And it's a lot of what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, just from a different perspective.
That's right.
From a different side of the equation. His episode is 174. I just was looking it up if people want to go check it out. It's called the tectonic forces are changing the industry. Will we listen? He had a lot of foreboding advice from brands in the early 2000s, and it was drawing parallels to maybe some of the direction that brands are going today.
Absolutely. It's that storytelling mindset. And I think if you incorporate that, because at the time, Nicholas was really high in the Salomon organization, and he had that creative mindset. He had that storytelling approach and embedded it within that organization from the high levels. And that, I mean, that trickled down. So, like, I mean, that's a solution if we're talking about solutions. It's keeping that mindset in high levels of the organization.
I want to talk about, or I want to ask you about this idea. So we were talking about marketing and creative as being two
Mhm.
separate entities, but they also need each other, like they're symbiotic. Something I hear when people talk about creative,
Yeah,
they talk about like taking swings and like not being afraid to take risks or risk management and not wanting to take risks because of the fear of failure.
yeah,
And when I think about, I wonder if that's the wrong mentality to have, because I think that sort of language assumes that if you're going to take a bold stance with a piece of creative, that it inherently is like it's either going to be a flop or it's either going to be a success, and there's no
yeah,
way to hedge your bets and to do your research to
right,
inform good creative.
right.
And I guess I want to come back to that idea because I feel like there's so much that can be done if you have the time to really validate good creative before it goes out into the world, to take this quote unquote big risk and de-risk it through research, through an understanding of your audience, through testing, through insights, through white space analysis. Like there's so much that can be done, and I realize that sounds like a lot, and it sounds like it costs a lot, and it sounds like it would take a long time. But if the alternative is putting out creative that flops or doesn't stand for anything, like, wouldn't we want to take the more detailed process to produce things that work?
I think that, I mean, the first thing I would want to back up and say, defining creative in an organization is this shouldn't be like one department or one group that is your, like, this should be a mindset across the organization. I mean, even over in your operations groups, there should be a creative approach to problem solving, to coming up with ways to maybe allow your company to do things you might not otherwise be able to do within like stringent existing like processes. Like, this is a mindset within an organization and should not be siloed within one department, because it's difficult if you're creative and you're handed things way downstream, and you have to come up with the story in arrears on why this product should be relevant. I mean, this should be like way upstream in the process and embedded in the group. What was the rest of your question
Yeah,
then?
my question is, like, people talk about creative being this thing that's either
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like a big swing,
right,
but like there
right,
are ways to manage that risk.
right, and it's you can talk about like white space analysis. You can get all like MBA on it, but the what I see as being the most successful is when these brands and the people that work there are just passionate themselves about the audience that they're speaking to, and they're just part of it. They're at the events. They know the athletes on a personal level. Like, they are within just the zeitgeist of this culture that their brand is striving to be a part of. And then the insights then are just their lifestyle. Like, you're just in it. And I think it's perceived as risk by people that don't know it or understand it that well. But if like in this example, this sport of running really well, if you know the athletes, if you've been to the New York City Marathon like a dozen times, like you can very comfortably speak to that audience and know what resonates with them, and that doesn't feel risky at all to you. And so the data angle is difficult because it of course should not be like completely neglected, but I think it becomes a crutch in that it's an easy scapegoat if something goes wrong to be like, well, the data said that, and so I just followed the data, so it's not my fault. And that is a very safe approach because everyone wants to keep their jobs. And not that I think you should be maybe that's the problem, is this perception that you're going to be fired if you get this wrong. I think the corporations, these businesses should just encourage more risk taking, trust their people, live the lifestyle that you're speaking to, and just be in it. And that is the way to mitigate a lot of that risk, in my experience.
Do you feel like the brands feel like they're taking a risk with a piece of creative is because they don't fully understand their audience?
I think the people that make decisions high up in organizations, that they themselves don't, very well understand the audience, I think then they perceive things as big risks. And so they want to see data that back everything up to make those decisions. And when you're trying to take a big risk, or you're trying to do something new, like in Satisfy's example, there isn't going to be data that's going to show that. Because if there was data that showed that, every brand would probably have that data, and they'd all probably be doing the same thing. And so a lot of those new ideas that don't have the data to support them because they're new they just don't happen most of the time.
But you're not anti-data.
No, of course not. I mean, I think that if I'm trying to make decisions, I want to have as much data as I can to see where things are going, to see maybe where trends are, what has worked, what hasn't worked. All that informs ideas. But I wouldn't make a decision solely based on, well, the data says to do this. But personally, within maybe our group that really knows our audience really well, that doesn't align, or that has already been done before and doesn't speak to our story. I'm not going to follow that just because the data says to.
Yeah, I like that. It's
balanced.
It's balanced. It can inform. It's meant as a jumping off platform for brainstorming further. What do you think about gut feels? In the creative space, that gets thrown around a lot. Like, oh, I have a gut feeling that this is going to work. Do you trust your gut? When do you not trust your gut?
I trust my gut when other people that I also trust will align with a gut feeling. I mean, that's sort of probably the double check for me, is I have others whose opinions and whose perspectives that I trust, if they can support, and that's where teams are important, right? That you can work together then towards those ideas. So I think the gut feelings often come from insights, maybe in your brain that you can't quite connect the dots like logically, but I think there's a lot behind the scenes, from an intuition standpoint, that give those a lot more validity than maybe we're able to articulate initially. So I love diving down those roads. A lot of times there's something there.
I guess something we haven't defined necessarily is we're talking about creative. We're talking about organizations upstream maybe needing more creative, or creative being baked into the culture. Like, what does that even mean to you?
To have creative baked into the culture?
Is it a mindset? Can you define that to some degree?
Yeah, it's absolutely a mindset. It's thinking differently. It's not necessarily following examples. It's iterating on things. It's trying to push the envelope of what's possible. It's a mindset that, like I think I spoke to before, that wants to be original, that fears imitation, and that just dares to be different. And I think rewarding that and making space for that within an organization, and not punishing people for taking those chances, those risks on having new ideas, goes a really, really long way in the longevity of a brand.
Well, you mentioned the episode we did with Chris Burkard.
Yeah.
He had a quote that I remember him saying. He said something like, today, creatives are being asked to give directions to a destination that doesn't exist. And I think he summarized really well much of what we're talking about right here. I'm curious, how does that quote strike you? Do you feel like 100% aligned with that in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, I thought that episode really, really resonated with me. A lot of times you're not given, I think Chris actually spoke to this, and this aligns with my experience. A lot of times you're given, these expectations for a campaign or a project, and what the brand wants out of those is very unclear. And so that's sort of this like destination, right? That is unknown. And the creative is supposed to be, the person shooting a campaign is sort of a black box that's just supposed to make something amazing that's going to shine. And it's difficult to be in that position when you're a creative, because you want some parameters, you want some goals, you want to know how the project's going to show up in the world, what the outlets are, the channels are going to be, and a lot of those things help you to make something unique and make something engaging. So I think that's what he's speaking to there, is you're sort of being asked to do something without knowing what the where you're going with it, and that's a difficult position to be in. Yeah, it really kind of speaks to, I think, the need we see upstream for a little bit more direction from brand to brand storytelling.
If that's an observation that
Yeah.
multiple creatives have, does that not highlight an opportunity for creatives that they could step into?
I think what you see is that's where the creator, is a sort of influencer in economy, I think has been really successful.
Yeah.
I think they've been able to weave unique stories, know where they're going, be authentic to themselves, and do things that brands are really trying to speak to and trying to do themselves, and why brands are trying to, attach themselves within marketing campaigns to a lot of influencers and a lot of creatives. I wrote up recently on my newsletter about Jamil Khoury running in the Strava Chipotle challenge down in Tempe. Did you see
I
this
think I saw the
storyline?
headline. I
Okay.
didn't read it in your newsletter.
So, and this is an example of just like a storytelling clinic that I think a lot of brands try to emulate, but we see creators do really well. So I'll give you the overview here. So Strava does a challenge, or Chipotle, I suppose, does a Strava challenge in conjunction with Strava. And they have 25 cities that they chose this year across the country, and they create a short Strava segment. In this case, it's like a 2-block stretch of road, that runs in front of a Chipotle store. And the way a local legend works on Strava is, whoever runs that particular segment the most becomes a local legend, and that they're the one that just runs it most frequently. So over the course of January, whoever runs this segment the most times gets a year's worth of Chipotle. So it becomes a competition between cities to see, right, which city can collectively run the farthest on this segment. But also within those cities, people are just running back and forth. I mean, it's a 0.2 mile section of road, and people are just going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on this. So Jamil Khoury, who leads Air Viper Running, Mountain Outpost, owns Ultra Running Magazine, is really prevalent within the trail running world. He decided to storytell this whole thing. So he ran back and forth on this segment for the month of January. He ran 735 miles in the month of January on a 0.2 mile segment, which is like thousands of back and forth, right? But he storytold the whole thing. He made I don't even know how many YouTube, like 12 or 15 YouTube episodes. He was going live on Instagram with it. He was live on YouTube with it. He was on podcasts while he was running and moving back and forth. He got injured. There was another guy he was going against, and they were kind of like jockeying for top position. It was this whole thing. And is it arbitrary and silly? Of course it is. But it was told so well that it just engaged the whole trail running and ultra running world. I did it. You can find the write-up on my Substack, but the reach that he had was amazing. I mean, he has 50,000 followers on Instagram. But as of a couple days ago, he had almost 1 million views, not impressions, views,
Wow.
across the reels that he had posted, which is a ton. I mean, if you look at a brand like Hoka or someone that has, over 1 million followers, that's typically the views, that they're getting over the course of that month. So he's punching from, 50K to over 1 million followers. Like, he's punching way above his weight. And just for him to do that all by himself while he was running was just an incredible feat. So I think that storytelling clinic was a way to, one example of how to really speak to experiences and reach an audience with an engaging story, right? Like he had the antagonist, he had obstacles, he had little, sub stories, and it was just a storytelling master class that was told not with some like amazing amount of production value, but with really well, really good storytelling that was very much within, his character, within his voice, within his personality, and that really hit.
Did Chipotle, like, do they get involved at all with what he was doing, or do they just let him run wild?
They let him run wild. Basically, Chipotle really stays a bit hands off. He mentioned that they wanted to borrow one piece that he made, but I couldn't find it on their social media or anywhere. So I know
Yeah.
they apparently used it somewhere, but I couldn't find it. But no, he couldn't even park in the Chipotle lot at the restaurant, like to do all this running. So the whole parking, and he got towed. Like this was like a whole part, some part of the story. And no, they're really hands off. They had absolutely nothing to do with the storytelling he was doing.
So, okay, this is what I wonder about. So I'm gonna go in. Let's go into Chipotle corporate, their HQ. Like, did they sit down and think? Do they have some unique gut feel or insight that drew the connection between Chipotle and Strava and runners, and that's why this challenge arose, or was it just some
Yes.
harebrained idea that just happened to work?
If you are within the trail running, ultra running industry, and you work in that space, you know how much everyone loves a burrito. You know there are burritos at the aid stations. You know how a burrito after the race is really good, and you can really connect the product with that audience. And so that, I think, is what they knew they could tap into. And by creating this challenge and then just being hands off and letting people run with it, they really created a forum for people like Jamil to be creative within. Yeah.
Does the ultra running community love burritos more than just the general outdoor community? Is there?
I mean, I don't know. I think they consume more because you have to be fueling so much. And when you're going slower, right, because you're going farther, you can stomach a burrito more than if you're like, running it, sprinting through a 10K. I wonder if it would work in the outdoor community, a bit more at large too, because
Yeah, I wonder.
we all love we all have a good burrito, especially breakfast one.
I've got a lot of good burrito ideas I'll share with you at some point later.
I love a good burrito story.
Fun fact today, one of them I was on a shoot a couple weeks ago and it gave me food poisoning and I was sick on an airplane for like 8 hours and it was absolutely miserable. But the first day of the shoot rolled around and I was in good shape and I was ready to eat another burrito.
So you can't get sick of burritos.
No. What about, so we talked about some hypothetical solutions to, I guess we haven't been as critical as I thought we would be. So I think well done us. But let's talk about solutions. Like, what are things that you think the industry could be doing differently to seek after better? Again, whatever that means.
Well, maybe we could try to summarize some of the ones that have kind of come up already within our conversation, right?
Great.
You can help me do that too. The one is to embed with your audience, live the lifestyle. Don't be disconnected with your audience such that they're just data points that you're trying to mine for insights. Be in it yourself. Your employees should be living it very high up within the organization. I think that sort of lifestyle connection, it authentically, within your life, your passion, that is probably point number one that I think leads to success.
Yeah. Would it be too presumptuous for point number two to be something to the effect of don't just rely on your creative partners to execute, but maybe give them a little space to brainstorm and give some feedback upstream?
I agree. I think choosing your partners is probably where that starts. And if they also very much know your audience and live in that world, there's a lot of really smart creative photographers and filmmakers. Lean on them for insights and for their opinions, and allow them upstream into the process. A lot of times, and you could probably speak to this too, you talk to a client and they're like, oh, we don't know, we're still working on the brief, we'll be in touch with you when it's all locked. that's always a mistake, I think. Bring the creative in, before the brief is developed. Like, let them into it and take their feedback into account.
Awesome. Maybe point number 3 would be use a blend of gut feelings and data to form good creative that maybe doesn't have as much risk as it would have.
Yes, I think that kind of hits on point number 1 a bit, because if you want to have that gut feeling, you have to really be embedded into the audience, right? That's where that comes from. That human intuition, I guess, is what we're referring to as gut feeling. So if you have that, then yes, I think you weigh that as much as you weigh the data, if not more, in my opinion, from my perspective, to make insights and make decisions.
What else?
I think the other thing we talked about is the brand story and the authenticity of what the brand means, what the brand's messaging is, and helping that to be distinct within, your marketing, your campaigns, the productions that we're being asked to execute. Ensuring that is another key to success. That's a little bit, I don't know, maybe more difficult. I mean, what do you think? Like, what are the campaigns that you've worked on that maybe were the most distinct, and why were that way?
Mm.
To turn it around on you. But you have a lot of experience too, so I want to learn from you too, Cole.
I think I've used this example a lot, but I think I bring it up because it worked well.
Yeah.
We did a feature doc with Athletic Brewing Company. We made
Great.
a film about three Ironman athletes.
Great.
And looking back, I think we kind of got lucky choosing Ironman as our venue, as our world that we told this story.
Yeah.
Because there weren't a ton of stories that were being told in that space that were maybe being done at a level that, like, there was room to grow. There was
Great.
some quality that we could grow into in that world. And I think the film, one of the reasons it did well is because there was an appetite for that type of content in that world that maybe was a little different than would have been being done before.
Yeah.
And before I started saying that, I knew exactly how that connected to your question, and now I'm totally spacing on why I bring that up.
Like being distinct, like how.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And in that case, it sounds like they found a vertical or a world or a culture that maybe wasn't being spoken to,
but also
as
aligned super well with who they were as a brand. So
That's
it was
right.
this beautiful marrying of an opportunity from the content perspective and from their brand.
There was another example I would say that speaks to that too, is a newer brand in the running space called Mount to Coast. So they're making shoes that have a really, it's a great foam that makes their midsole, without getting like into the details of it, and it lasts a really, really, really long time without breaking down and like crushing out, like a lot of shoes might wear out when they do. And so they came into the running world from this angle of like road ultra running, which is super niche even compared to like trail ultra running. But there wasn't anyone, like you were speaking to before, there wasn't any brands really speaking to that audience specifically, even though it was small. And so they've been really successful thus far. And I think that speaks to the value of not necessarily going for the biggest audience, but going for like a distinct audience, allowing your brand to stand out, and then maybe you can branch out from there. But that foothold, like you were talking about with Ironman, like I think that really worked with Mount to Coast and the road ultra running audience.
Yeah, but if you pick an audience that, I mean, is a tight, like well-knit community,
Niche,
super niche, like that, and if it's done well, like it's gonna spread like wildfire.
I agree. And maybe that goes back to our Satisfy example, right? I mean, how many people would have told you that if you described this dissatisfied lifestyle and aesthetic, that really speaks to them, it probably would have seemed like such a small audience, right? But once they put it out there into the world, a lot of people saw that and said, oh, like, I think that's cool, and I get that, or I relate to that. And it drew a lot, it had a lot more magnetism to it than you could have seen coming.
Well, isn't that kind of like that expression, you only need like 1,000 true fans?
I think that's true.
And
Yeah.
obviously the numbers are different when you're talking about a national or an international brand, but I think the it's still there. The truth is still there to some degree. Like, content doesn't need to be for everyone. Your brand doesn't need to be for everyone. But if it's for a very specific group of people, like that's where you want to start.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of a larger social media conversation, right? Like, what is the quality versus quantity, maybe from engagement, right? And all these
Yeah.
engagement metrics. And if you really go with less, if you speak to less people, but you speak to them more deeply, that can have as much or more power maybe than a surface level connection with a lot more people.
But to be fair, I think I would love to tease that out and like do multiple episodes on this idea of quality
could.
versus quantity, because
You could.
yeah, I think it's easy to say, like, I want to be the person, I want to say, oh, quality all the way. But I don't know if I can entirely back that up.
It's like a lot of things. It isn't like one isn't good and the other one's bad. There's balances and there's pros and cons to both, depending on your brand, your situation, like maybe the point in your life cycle, those sorts, like the type of product you're trying to launch, right? And if it's a completely new product or if it's sort of an established like product category, like there's always situations where quality versus quantity, one might be better than the other. So it's yeah, there's a lot more nuance to it than just, this one's good, this one's bad.
Are there any other points that we should summarize?
That's about all that comes to mind, I think, for me, maybe that we talked about.
Maybe one, and I guess this kind of maybe encapsulates many of them, but the distinction perhaps between marketing and creative.
Yes.
And maybe understanding that if they are unique, maybe better understanding creative starts with knowing, oh, maybe it isn't exactly like marketing, and maybe just having that understanding can help unlock some great creative potential.
Yeah, I'd be interested on feedback from people on that distinction. What makes a marketing person versus maybe more of a creative person? How do you differentiate the two? Because there's the originality, the original thinking, and the courage to be brave and do something different from that creative mindset, I think has a lot of value in a lot more situations than we like to see, right, Cole?
I'll keep thinking on that. I 50% of me agrees with you.
Fair.
Another 25% wants to push back, and I don't know about the other 25%.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the point. I want to get people thinking about some of these things. You don't have to agree. I'm not offended, but in my mind, there's a distinction there, and I think I come at it from that creative point of view as much as marketing. So I see both sides too.
Where do you hope the industry goes? If you could wave a magic wand and every brand could become creative, whatever that means, like,
oh man,
what would you want to see of our industry?
I mean, I think, like, first of all, going back to the way we started the conversation, everything's changing so quickly now that everyone's trying to figure things out. And so I hope this conversation has just helped people to think about how they're approaching things. And I don't proclaim to be right about everything, but these are some of the thoughts running through my head. And if anybody has any feedback, learning from each other and prolonging these conversations, I think, is just really valuable for us all to become better.
Maybe one thing to add is, I guess, in a world where the entire industry is just thriving creatively, the sea of sameness would be a dried up sea, right? Hopefully, theoretically.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always, I think there's a bit of a place for that predictability of you doing things that have worked before. I just think we've tilted a little bit too far in that direction. And I'd like to see a little more balance with brand new ideas, things that, if I see a brand do something and it may not work, but it was really different and it was a good swing, like, maybe I'm in the minority, but I have a lot more respect for that brand, and I'm like really more excited about it. It's like, oh, they took a swing, like they tried to do something different, and maybe that didn't work, but the people internally there are, I think they're really thinking the right way, and there's probably something really cool coming. So personally, I like to kind of lift up those approaches.
I love it. Matt, if folks want to follow along with you, if they want
Yeah.
to find your Substack, where can they find you?
Yeah, so the Substack newsletter is called A Matter of Brand. So a matterofbrand.substack.com. And you can find my portfolio website is matttrappe.com or trappephoto.com. They both link to the same site. The brand I started in running is called Tour Sportif. It's a lifestyle running brand that really leans into the idea that running is an art, and the process and the lifestyle of that more than a performance sport. And so you can find the work that I'm doing there. That's kind of a playground for me to experiment with a lot of the branding and storytelling ideas that I have. But yeah, I'm on Instagram a lot. Trappe Photo is my handle. TRAPPEPHOTO. You can interact with me there too. Thanks.
Right on. Matt, thanks for the conversation.
Appreciate it, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.